Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about the difference between telling a story and telling the whole story. Let's go down to the beach and talk about that. So over the last few days, I have seen a number of reports in both print media and on YouTube regarding the protester at the Atlanta area Cop City thing who was supposedly shot with his hands raised while sitting cross-legged. In fact, if you look at some of these reports in the media, they don't report this as what could be or what might be a reasonable assumption from an autopsy. They tend to report it as fact. And there are some really good reasons why we need to be careful about making jumps that are unsupported by evidence. Before we get there, I want to talk about somebody who is really high on my I'm really ticked at you list, and that is Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin, the person who is primarily responsible for having killed George Floyd, has pretty much destroyed the illusion in the minds of American society that cops are the good guys. Now, cops have to be considered in some instances to be the bad guys. When I was a kid, in second, third, fourth grade, I can remember police coming to the school and telling us, look, if you get lost, find a policeman. If you have a problem, find a policeman. If somebody hurts you, find a policeman. And I can remember telling my children the exact same thing. For many years, police enjoyed a presumption that they were good actors. Now, because of the media and the publicity and everything else about George Floyd and several other instances where police officers have acted as evil people, particularly the Memphis case most recently, I think you really have to question now whether or not that is always good advice. And I hate that we are living in a society where our protectors can also be our oppressors. The solution to that is better screening before hiring of police officers, better training, and better enforcement of laws related to the excessive use of force. Most excessive use of force cases don't involve firearms. They involve people who get upset and start using their fists in a way that they shouldn't. And again, that is unfortunate because when you come to a situation like the one that we're discussing today about this protester who was shot, the presumption that police are always right and always do the right thing has to go out the window. And it has to be analyzed on the facts and data that are present. Now, here is what we know from multiple sources. First, there were a bunch of protesters on this land who were supposedly defenders of the forest, keeping in mind, of course, that all of the forest where this building is going to be built had already been cleared. So they weren't defending the forest. They just seized that as the moral high ground here. Second, the people who were there were trespassing and were in the process of being removed by police. During that process, Georgia State Patrol troopers were in the area when the protester at issue here fired a shot that hit a trooper, and he was killed by return fire. He was hit by 14 bullets, which probably sounds like a lot until you realize that there are other troopers shooting at the same time, and those other troopers may not hear the shots that are being fired by their compatriots. He was hit by a lot of bullets, and he died. Any man's death is a tragedy. His death is certainly no less of a tragedy by virtue of the fact that he started the chain of events that got him killed. When you fire a weapon at a police officer, the officer does not have to wait to be hit to fire back. In this case, he did, but he doesn't have to. And when you shoot a police officer, there is a really good chance you are going to get lit up just the way this gentleman did. Now, we know from the facts that have been reported by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation so far that the handgun that was found on his person or next to his person is the same firearm that shot the trooper. Now, because the family was upset and because they are, to be quite honest, radicalized, they commissioned a second autopsy from an autopsy physician by the name of Chris Sperry. Chris Sperry used to be one of the medical examiners, but he had to resign after he was caught logging hundreds of hours that he didn't actually work. And here's what ABC News Online says. It says the autopsy was conducted by Dr. Chris Sperry, who was the Investigation Bureau's longtime chief medical examiner until he abruptly resigned in 2015 after the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported that Sperry claimed hundreds of work hours at the GBI when he was actually working for clients of his forensic science consulting firm. Now, if you were previously the GBI's medical examiner and now you have an opportunity to perhaps get back at the GBI, does that color your conclusions? Well, nothing says it has to, and there's no evidence that it did. But at the very least, it should raise some suspicions. Now, what can an autopsy tell you? Well, it can tell you the difference between an entrance wound and an exit wound. It can tell you the manner of death, whether it was from firearms or some other source, and usually, presumptively, whether it was a homicide. In this case, it was a homicide. The only issue is whether it was a justified homicide or not, and it seems pretty clear that it was a justified homicide, given the fact that he shot first. What is really rather strange here is that in the autopsy report, it says he was sitting cross-legged with his hands raised. And in support of this, it says there were exit wounds found on his palm. Okay. This is the palm. If this is the exit wound, the entrance wound had to come from here. So essentially, the bullet is going just like that. People do not turn around and put their hands up or sit facing the opposite direction and put their hands up, because that doesn't make any sense, because he fired the weapon and hit the patrol officer. And equally unsupported, the conclusion that he was sitting cross-legged with his hands up, is the fact that the autopsy professional here, Dr. Sperry, said it's impossible to tell whether he was holding a gun at the time he was shot. Well, if it's impossible to tell if he was holding a gun, how can you tell what position he was in? Well, if you can't tell whether he was holding a gun, and there's a gun in his possession and a round has been fired from it, does it really make any sense to believe that he was sitting cross-legged and he shot back like this? Because the bullets had to come that way. He had to be facing away from the people who were shooting him at the time that he was shot in order for the exit wound to be on the palm. Now, if the entrance wound had been on the palm, okay, maybe he was trying to surrender. But he was doing a really stupid thing first, which is what got him shot. You have to think about some of the biases that someone might have regarding the fact that they've had to resign in disgrace because they were caught doing things they shouldn't have been doing. You have to worry about that in this situation, because a lot of times people have scores to settle and they use highly charged, high-profile cases to settle those scores. I'm not saying that that did happen. I'm saying that that is something that ought to be evaluated when you evaluate this. I would also point out, again, getting back to this issue of telling a story instead of the whole story, that only on USA Today and ABC News do you find the disclaimer that he had resigned previously because of discrepancies in his reporting or whatever. The fact of the matter is, you only get that on these two sources, and everybody else simply reports that the autopsy says this. It doesn't provide you with information where you can go track this down yourself and figure out who did the autopsy and what his qualifications are, what his biases might be. Again, that should raise some suspicion in your mind about what's going on here. Because if somebody is not being candid about all of the facts, then you have to worry about whether or not any of the facts are actually correct. Now, again, if the doctor had crime scene photographs and he could figure out what position this man was in when he fired the gun or when he was shot, that may be different. But that does not seem to me to be what happened. And I would also point out that the DeKalb County medical examiner did the first autopsy. So the second autopsy is being done after the first autopsy, and as a result, it's difficult to tell whether or not the first autopsy may have done things that altered the conclusions in the second autopsy. Again, difficult to know. I won't even speculate on that. My point in all of this is, if indeed that gentleman was trying to surrender at the time that he was shot, and he did have his hands up, as they say, then it certainly doesn't square with the information from that autopsy. And second of all, if he was shot because he fired on the troopers, again, presumptively, it would be a justified shooting. All of that said, again, it's a tragedy for the family. It's a tragedy for the community. And it would be really nice if when people protested, they did so peacefully. Instead, people go out there, they burned some of the heavy equipment that was moving some of the land. They did all kinds of damage, and they've all been charged with domestic terrorism, as they should be. In this country, if you don't like something, you use the democratic process to get what you want. You do not throw a fit and act like a bunch of hooligans or a bunch of domestic terrorists in order to get what you want. So when you see information in the media about how something happened, what a particular report says, go get the report. Go find out who the people are who did the autopsy. Make some analysis about the quality of their work and their reputation. I can virtually assure you that if this case were to go to court, the cross-examination of this pathologist would be brutal. And I think it would call into question in a reasonable jury's minds whether or not there was some other motivation for some of these findings. Maybe there wasn't. I don't know. Not my place to judge. I'm just saying you have to be a little skeptical. Just as you should be skeptical of the DeKalb County medical examiner if indeed there are findings inconsistent with the crime scene or findings inconsistent with other witnesses. You should always be skeptical, because the one thing I have found in the practice of law is that everyone lies. And they tend to lie most often when there is something that they expect to get or something that they expect to avoid. And as a result of that, you have to use the Reagan principle of trust but verify. Yes, listen to the testimony. Turn it over in your mind the way the Murdaugh jurors did. and evaluate whether it's reasonable or unreasonable. Reach a decision and move on. Again, I am firmly in support of peaceful, nonviolent protest about things you don't like. I may not agree that cop cities shouldn't be built because, after all, we all agree police could use more training. I may not agree with that, but I will support your right to protest that till the day is done, because I want to make sure that if I want to protest, I have that right. And so we can't have it both ways. We can't criticize protesters who are peaceful and nonviolent, because indeed, that is how Martin Luther King Jr. managed to change our attitudes on civil rights, by being peaceful and persistent. Martin Luther King didn't burn down any buildings, and he didn't torch any heavy equipment. And that's a lesson that today's protesters need to learn from, because I don't think they've gotten the message. Anyway, that's what I have for you today. I'm sure that there will be some people who disagree with this, and I think that's fine. You're absolutely entitled to disagree. I would welcome your views. I would ask you to keep them respectful. I would ask you not to use any profane language, because we have a number of people on this channel. Sometimes kids get on here, and as a result of that, I want to make sure that they don't have an unpleasant experience or have to deal with a lot of ugly language. And feel free to disagree. Just be polite, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you for watching, and I hope everybody has a terrific day. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.